He thought he had already won, until one silence changed everything. What happens when pure arrogance meets a Philadelphia legend? This is the story that will make you question everything you know about strength, humility, and what it truly means to be a champion. Drop a in the comments if you think you know how this ends, and stay until the final bell, because what happens next will shock you. The sweat-stained walls of Mickey's gym in South Philadelphia had witnessed countless battles, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold on this humid Tuesday evening. The air hung thick with the scent of leather and determination, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of gloves against heavy bags. Tommy "Thunder" Castellano strutted through the gym's entrance like he owned the place, his designer tracksuit gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. At 22 years old, Tommy had carved out a reputation as the most promising heavyweight prospect on the East Coast, boasting a perfect record of 15 knockouts in 15 fights. His entourage of 6 men followed closely behind, their expensive suits and gold chains catching the light as they surveyed the modest gym with barely concealed disdain. Tommy's manager, Vinny Torino, a slick-talking promoter from Atlantic City, whispered encouragement into his fighter's ear while mentally calculating the publicity value of whatever stunt they were about to pull. The gym's regulars, weathered fighters who had seen everything the sport had to offer, paused their training to watch this unusual procession. There was something different about this visit, something that made the older fighters exchange knowing glances and shake their heads with concern. Tommy's eyes scanned the room like a predator sizing up its territory, his perfectly styled hair and unblemished face marking him as someone who had never truly been tested. He had heard whispers about this place, about the legends who had trained here, but to him it was just another stepping stone in his meteoric rise to fame and fortune. The young fighter's confidence bordered on arrogance as he approached the front desk, where Mickey Goldmill's nephew was handling the evening shift. "I heard the great Rocky Balboa trains here," Tommy announced loudly, his voice carrying across the gym and causing several heads to turn. "I want to see what all the fuss is about." His words dripped with condescension, each syllable carefully calculated to provoke a reaction. The nephew behind the desk shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dangerous gleam in Tommy's eyes. This wasn't just a casual visit from another fighter looking to spar. This was a challenge wrapped in expensive clothing and delivered with the kind of swagger that only came from never having faced real adversity. The atmosphere in the gym shifted palpably, as if everyone present could sense that something significant was about to happen, something that would be talked about for years to come. Tommy Castellano's presence filled the gym like smoke from a fire, impossible to ignore and increasingly suffocating. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, his muscles rippling beneath his fitted shirt as he shadowboxed for the benefit of his audience. 15 fights, 15 knockouts, he proclaimed to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from never having tasted defeat. His entourage nodded enthusiastically, their agreement as choreographed as a Broadway show. Vinny Torino pulled out his phone and began recording, knowing that whatever happened next would be perfect material for Tommy's growing social media presence. The gym's atmosphere grew tense as Tommy began critiquing the equipment, running his manicured fingers along the worn leather of the heavy bags with obvious disapproval. "This is what champions train with?" he asked mockingly, his question directed at no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Several of the older fighters bristled at the disrespect, their hands clenching into fists as they watched this young upstart mock the sacred ground where legends had been forged. Tommy seemed oblivious to the growing hostility, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His success had come so easily, so completely, that he had begun to believe his own hype. Every opponent had fallen within the first 3 rounds, usually victims of his devastating left hook that had earned him his nickname, Thunder. The sports media had dubbed him the next great heavyweight hope, and the praise had gone straight to his head like expensive champagne. He began recounting his victories in vivid detail, describing how he had destroyed fighters who had once been considered prospects themselves. His voice grew louder and more animated with each story, his hands gesturing wildly as he reenacted his greatest moments. The gym's regulars exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the dangerous combination of talent and arrogance that stood before them. They had seen fighters like Tommy before, young, gifted, and completely unprepared for the harsh realities that awaited anyone who stepped into the ring without proper respect for the sport. But there was something different about this particular display of ego, something that suggested Tommy wasn't just here to show off. The way his eyes kept darting toward the gym's back rooms, the questions he kept asking about who trained here, the obvious setup of his manager's camera, it all pointed to something more calculated than simple braggadocio. This wasn't just about disrespecting Mickey's gym. This was about creating a moment, a viral sensation that would launch Tommy's career into the stratosphere. The tension in Mickey's gym reached a boiling point as Tommy Castellanos' performance grew more elaborate and offensive. He had now moved to the speed bag area, where he began demonstrating his lightning-fast hand combinations while providing his own commentary like a deranged sports announcer. "And there's the thunder left hook that put Iron Mike Henderson to sleep in round 2, he declared, throwing a punch that sent the speed bag into a frenzied rhythm. His entourage cheered on cue, their artificial enthusiasm grating on the nerves of everyone else in the gym. The older fighters began gathering closer, their weathered faces showing mixtures of disgust and anticipation. They knew something was coming. They could feel it in the air, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. Tommy seemed to feed off their attention, both positive and negative, his movements becoming more exaggerated and his voice growing louder with each passing minute. He began calling out specific fighters who trained at the gym, mocking their techniques and questioning their heart. "I heard Joey the Hammer Martinez comes here," Tommy said with a sneer, referring to a former contender who now trained young fighters. "Funny how hammers can get bent out of shape when they meet real steel." The insult hit its mark, and Joey stepped forward from the crowd, his fists clenched and his face red with anger. For a moment, it seemed like violence was inevitable, but Vinny Torino quickly stepped between them, his hands raised in a gesture of false peace. Now, gentlemen," Vinny said with an oily smile, "Tommy's not here to fight the has-beens and never was. He's looking for the main event, the headliner, the legend himself." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the gym knew exactly who he was talking about. Tommy's eyes lit up with malicious glee as he realized his manager had set up the moment perfectly. "That's right," Tommy said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the gym. "I came here to see if the great Rocky Balboa is everything the history books say he is, or if he's just another old-timer living off past glory." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of a train rumbling past on the elevated tracks outside. Even Tommy's entourage seemed to sense they had crossed a line, their expressions shifting from confident smirks to nervous uncertainty. The words had barely left Tommy Castellanos' mouth when the gym's atmosphere shifted dramatically, as if someone had just turned down the temperature by 20 degrees. The older fighters who had been watching with growing irritation suddenly straightened up, their expressions transforming from annoyance to something approaching reverence mixed with protective anger. Mickey Goldmill's nephew behind the front desk quietly reached for the phone, his fingers hovering over the numbers as he debated whether to make a call that could change everything. Tommy seemed oblivious to the change in mood, his arrogance acting like armor against the subtle signals that anyone with real boxing experience would have recognized immediately. He continued his performance, now focusing on the gym's collection of faded photographs that lined the walls like a shrine to Philadelphia boxing history. "Look at all these old-timers," he said dismissively, gesturing toward images of fighters from decades past. "Their time is over. This is the new generation's moment." His finger stopped at a particular photo. a black and white image of a young Rocky Balboa from his early fighting days, sweat-drenched and victorious after a hard-fought bout. Tommy studied the image with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing an opponent's weaknesses. "So this is the famous Rocky Balboa," he mused aloud, his voice dripping with manufactured disappointment. "Doesn't look like much to me. Just another South Philly tough guy who got lucky a few times." The sound of someone dropping their gym bag echoed through the suddenly quiet space, followed by the deliberate footsteps of approaching fighters. Tommy's entourage began to shift nervously, their earlier confidence wavering as they realized they might have miscalculated the situation. But Vinny Torino was too invested in his publicity stunt to back down now. He encouraged Tommy to continue, whispering reminders about the camera recording everything and the viral potential of what they were creating. Tommy needed little encouragement. The attention was like a drug to him, and he was completely addicted. He began comparing his own photograph, a glossy promotional shot that showed him flexing with perfect lighting and professional makeup, to the gritty, honest images of the gym's former champions. The contrast was striking. His manufactured perfection versus their authentic, battle-tested character. But what Tommy saw as evidence of his superiority, the gym's regulars recognized as the difference between someone who had been groomed for success and someone who had earned it through blood, sweat, and genuine sacrifice. As Tommy Castellanos' performance reached new heights of disrespect, the gym's back door opened with barely a whisper of sound. The change was so subtle that most people missed it entirely. But those who had spent years in boxing gyms recognized the shift immediately. The way conversations seemed to naturally quiet, the way movements became more deliberate, the way the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. A figure emerged from the shadows of the gym's rear training area, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to teach. Rocky Balboa, now in his 70s, but still carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a champion, stepped into the main training area. His appearance was unremarkable by design. Simple grey sweatpants, a faded Philadelphia Athletics t-shirt, and worn training shoes that had seen countless miles of roadwork through the city's streets. His hair, now completely silver, was slightly mussed from what appeared to be a training session, and a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead suggested he had been working the bags in the back room. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, deep, knowing, and filled with the kind of wisdom that could only come from a lifetime of facing adversity and emerging stronger. He moved through the gym like a man returning home, nodding to the regulars who immediately straightened up in his presence, their expressions shifting from anger to something approaching protective concern. The older fighters had seen this scenario play out before, young hotshots challenging legends they didn't understand, seeking fame through association rather than earning respect through dedication. Rocky's presence seemed to calm the agitated atmosphere, his mere existence serving as a reminder of what real greatness looked like. He approached the heavy bag area where Tommy was still holding court, but instead of confronting the young fighter directly, he began his own quiet routine. Rocky pulled on a pair of well-worn gloves, the leather soft and pliable from years of use, and began working the bag with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every punch was both an ending and a beginning. His movements were economical, purposeful, each strike landing with the kind of authority that could only come from decades of refinement. The sound of his gloves against the leather was different from Tommy's flashy displays, deeper, more resonant, carrying the weight of authentic power rather than showmanship. The contrast between Rocky Balboa's quiet professionalism and Tommy Castellanos' loud performance became increasingly apparent as both fighters continued their respective routines. Rocky worked the heavy bag with a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat, each combination flowing naturally into the next like movements in a well-rehearsed dance. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourishes, just pure, concentrated boxing technique refined through decades of training and real-world application. His breathing was controlled and steady, a testament to the cardiovascular conditioning that had carried him through wars with Apollo Creed, Clubber Lang, and Ivan Drago. Meanwhile, Tommy's voice grew louder and more insistent as he sensed attention shifting away from him. He began directing his comments toward Rocky, though still addressing his entourage as if the older fighter couldn't hear him. "Now this is interesting," Tommy said, his tone shifting to one of mock appreciation. "The legend himself, still playing with the toys. Tell me, old man, do you still believe you are actually champion material, or do you know deep down that you just got lucky?" The gym fell completely silent, except for the continued sound of Rocky's gloves against the bag. The older fighter's rhythm never wavered, his focus never shifted, as if Tommy's words were just another distraction to be ignored while he concentrated on the work at hand. This lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Tommy, whose entire identity was built around generating responses from others. He had never encountered someone who could so completely dismiss his presence while remaining in the same space. Vinny Torino sensed the moment slipping away and quickly moved to escalate the situation. "My fighter here," he announced loudly, "has been looking for real competition. 15 knockouts, 15 fights. He's wondering if there's anyone in this gym who might give him a decent workout." The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound like a general challenge while specifically targeting Rocky. The older fighters in the gym tensed visibly, their hands unconsciously forming fists as they waited to see how their mentor would respond. But Rocky continued his routine, his gloves maintaining their steady percussion against the bag as if nothing unusual was happening. His face showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of the increasingly desperate attempts to provoke him. It was this complete self-control that began to unnerve Tommy, who was used to opponents either cowering before his reputation or rising to meet his challenges with obvious anger. Tommy Castellanos' frustration reached a critical point as Rocky Balboa continued to ignore his provocations with maddening composure. The young fighter's carefully constructed persona began to crack as he realized his usual tactics were having no effect on the legendary boxer. His voice took on a sharper edge, his movements becoming more aggressive as he stepped closer to where Rocky was training. "You know what I think?" Tommy said, his voice cutting through the gym's tense atmosphere like a blade. "I think all these stories about Rocky Balboa are just fairy tales. I think you were a tomato can who got lucky against some over-the-hill champions." The insult was designed to cut deep, attacking not just Rocky's abilities, but the very foundation of his legendary status. Several gym members shifted forward instinctively, ready to defend their mentor's honor, but Rocky raised one gloved hand almost imperceptibly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and restraint. Tommy misinterpreted this as weakness, his confidence surging as he pressed his attack. "Matter of fact," he continued, emboldened by what he saw as Rocky's reluctance to engage, "I bet I could take you right now, old man. Prime Tommy Thunder versus washed-up Rocky Balboa. What do you say we give these people a real show?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, its implications rippling through the gym's assembled crowd. This was the moment everyone had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Vinny Torino's camera captured every second, knowing that whatever happened next would be social media gold regardless of the outcome. The older fighters looked to Rocky expectantly, their faces showing mixtures of concern and loyalty. They knew their mentor well enough to recognize the signs of controlled anger beneath his calm exterior, the slightly tightened jaw, the almost imperceptible change in his breathing pattern, the way his shoulders settled into a familiar position that spoke of countless battles fought and won. But still Rocky continued his training, his gloves finding their target with mechanical precision, his eyes focused on something beyond the physical bag in front of him. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable for everyone except Rocky himself, who seemed to exist in a bubble of perfect concentration. Tommy's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage as he realized his grand challenge was being met with complete indifference. The atmosphere in Mickey's gym reached a breaking point as Tommy Castellano's desperation drove him to cross the final line of respect and decency. His face contorted with rage and humiliation. The young fighter stepped directly into Rocky Balboa's training space, forcing the older man to pause his routine. "I'm talking to you, you deaf old fool," Tommy shouted, his voice echoing off the gym's walls with disturbing intensity. "You think you're too good to acknowledge me? You think your ancient history makes you untouchable?" The verbal assault was accompanied by physical intimidation as Tommy moved to within inches of Rocky's face, his designer cologne clashing with the honest sweat and leather scents of the authentic gym environment. Rocky slowly removed his gloves, his movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the aggressive proximity of the young challenger. When he finally looked directly at Tommy, his eyes held depths that spoke of experiences the younger fighter couldn't begin to comprehend. The pain of defeat, the joy of victory, the weight of responsibility, and the hard-earned wisdom that came from a lifetime of facing adversity with grace. "You want to know about being a champion, son?" Rocky said quietly, his Philadelphia accent thick with emotion, but his tone remaining controlled. "It ain't about the wins and losses. It ain't about the belts or the money or the fame." His words carried a weight that seemed to physically press against Tommy's chest, each syllable delivered with the authority of someone who had lived every aspect of the boxing life. "Being a champion," Rocky continued, "is about how you treat people. It's about respect for yourself, for your opponents, for the sport that gives you everything you got." Tommy's expression shifted from arrogance to confusion as he found himself facing something he had never encountered before, genuine wisdom delivered without malice or condescension. The young fighter's entire worldview had been built around domination and superiority, concepts that suddenly seemed small and petty in the face of Rocky's quiet dignity. For the first time in his professional career, Tommy Castellano found himself truly uncertain, his practiced bravado wavering as he stared into the eyes of a man who had faced the best the sport had to offer and emerged not just victorious, but transformed. The moment of truth arrived with the subtle shift of Rocky Balboa's stance, a movement so small that only experienced fighters would recognize its significance. His feet found their familiar spacing, his hands settled into the guard position that had carried him through legendary battles, and his breathing steadied into the rhythm that had become second nature over decades of training. Tommy Castellano, still operating under the delusion that he was facing a broken-down old man, threw the first punch with all the arrogance and presumption that had defined his brief career. The right cross came fast and hard, exactly the kind of power shot that had ended 15 previous fights within the first few rounds. But this time, something different happened. Rocky's head moved just enough to let the punch whistle past his ear, the displacement so minimal that observers might have thought it was accidental, if not for the way Rocky's left hand simultaneously found its target. The counterpunch was not the devastating knockout blow that spectators might have expected from a Hollywood movie. Instead, it was something far more profound. A perfectly timed, technically precise hook to the body that landed with the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent perfecting the sweet science of boxing. The punch carried no malice, no anger, no desire for destruction. It was simply the inevitable result of superior skill meeting, inferior preparation, experience overcoming arrogance, wisdom trumping youth. Tommy's expression changed instantly from confident aggression to shocked bewilderment as he felt his legs buckle beneath him. The power behind Rocky's punch was different from anything he had ever experienced. Not the raw, brutal force he was accustomed to delivering and receiving, but something more refined, more complete, like the difference between a sledgehammer and a surgeon's scalpel. As Tommy sank to one knee, gasping for air that suddenly seemed in short supply, the gym erupted in a chaos of voices and emotions. Some cheered, some stood in stunned silence, others rushed forward to check on the fallen fighter. But through it all, Rocky remained exactly where he had been, his hands already returning to his sides, his breathing unchanged, his expression showing neither satisfaction nor concern. Just the quiet acceptance of a job completed with professional competence. The aftermath of Rocky Balboa's single punch created a transformation in Mickey's gym that was as profound as it was immediate. Tommy Castellano, still on one knee and struggling to process what had just happened to him, looked up at the man who had just shattered his entire understanding of strength, skill, and what it meant to be a fighter. For the first time in his life, Tommy was facing a reality that didn't conform to his expectations. He had been outclassed, not by someone younger, stronger, or more aggressive, but by someone who simply understood the sport at a level he had never imagined possible. Rocky extended his hand to help Tommy to his feet, the gesture carrying no trace of mockery or condescension. "You got talent, kid," Rocky said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had guided countless other young fighters over the years. "But talent without respect is just wasted potential. The ring will teach you what you need to know, but only if you're willing to listen." Tommy's entourage, led by the ever-calculating Vinny Torino, began making excuses and preparing their exit strategy, but Tommy himself remained frozen in place, staring at Rocky with the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about boxing, about competition, about himself, was fundamentally flawed. The older fighters in the gym began to disperse, their earlier tension replaced by the satisfied calm that came from witnessing justice served with quiet dignity. As Rocky began putting away his equipment with the same methodical care he brought to everything else, Tommy found his voice. "How?" was all he managed to say, but Rocky understood the depth of the question. 40 years of getting up every morning and doing the work," Rocky replied simply. 40 years of learning that being strong ain't about hurting people, it's about lifting them up." The lesson resonated through the gym like the echo of a bell, touching everyone present with the reminder that true greatness was measured not in victories accumulated, but in character demonstrated. Tommy Castellano left Mickey's gym that evening as a different person than the one who had entered, carrying with him the first real defeat of his career and, paradoxically, the first real opportunity for growth he had ever encountered. Sometimes the greatest victories happen when we learn to see strength not as domination, but as the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. Rocky Balboa didn't need to prove anything to Tommy Castellano or anyone else. He had already proven everything that mattered, not just in the ring, but in the way he carried himself through life. If this story reminded you that true champions are made not just through winning, but through how they treat others along the way, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that respect and humility will always triumph over arrogance and ego, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told.